Open it to Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50. I want us to read verse 20 tonight, and we'll use this to lead us into our study as we continue looking at apologetics. And tonight, we're going to talk about the problem of evil. The problem of evil. And so as we begin tonight, hear God's word from Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. This, of course, is kind of the end of the Joseph narrative. You remember the story of Joseph, the coat of many colors, disdained by his brothers, sold into slavery, long thought to be dead, but God raises him up to rule, second in command in Egypt. In a twist of fate and great irony, his brothers come back before him not knowing that it is he, and God has used him to preserve his family, to preserve really the entire world of that day through the severe famine that they were experiencing. Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. There's a big party, a great celebration. His father Jacob comes to him. They're all kind of living in Egypt, and then Jacob dies. And the brothers of Joseph are now worried. They're now thinking, man, our father is gone, and Joseph's going to get his revenge on us. And so here at the end of the Joseph narrative, they come before Joseph, basically pleading for mercy. And this is the response that Joseph gives to them. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. As for you, that is his brothers, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. May the Lord bless tonight the reading and the teaching of his word. So as I've mentioned already, we're in the middle of our study of apologetics. That is a study in looking at how we defend our faith, how we would answer questions regarding the faith that we have. And tonight we're going to look at the most profound challenge pertaining to belief in God. The problem of evil and the existence of suffering in the world. Now, previously in our study of apologetics, we had an introductory lesson where we just kind of gave some background and foundations in what apologetics is. And then we talked about how we would make the claim, the argument for the existence of God. And then we talked about how we would argue for the Bible being the Word of God. And then we talked about how we would argue or go about defending the claim that Jesus was the Son of God. And those are all kind of elementary arguments in regards to apologetics. But we're getting into the deep water tonight as we talk about the problem of evil. It is the most profound and challenging issue pertaining to belief or lack of belief in God. This is a very profuse challenge. Evil and the corresponding suffering it brings are widespread in our world. There's moral evil that is committed. So when we talk about evil, we're going to think in terms of two types. Moral evil, that's evil acts pitting one against another. Moral evil committed from one man to another man or one human to another human. This would be along the lines of murder, abuse, genocide, theft, lying, unjust war. You could imagine all the examples that kind of fit into this category. But there's also what's known as natural evil. So as we're thinking about evil tonight, the problem of evil, it's not just moral evil. It's just not evil committed by men, but it's also natural evil. That's the evil and suffering that's experienced in our lives through disasters, disease. Think about tornadoes that destroy entire towns and take innocent lives. Think about tsunamis that strike without warning. Think about cancers, heart disease, Alzheimer's, and then we could just keep on going with the list tonight, couldn't we? Disasters, disease, natural evil. And what we know is that there's no one, not one of us tonight, that can escape the evil and suffering in this world, whether moral or natural. We all experience it. A Barna poll conducted at one point asked the question, if you could ask God only one question and you knew that he would give you an answer, what would you ask? And the most common response received was, Why is there pain and suffering in this world? If you could ask God anything and know that you would be given an answer, what would you ask? And the common answer, why is there pain and suffering in this world? Why is there moral evil? Why is there natural evil? Why do we experience tragedy, disease, murder, genocide, abuse? Why is there gratuitous evil, seemingly pointless evil, suffering and evil that occurs with seemingly no point in mind? Why is this the way the world is? It's a pressing question to a very prolific issue. Why all the pain and suffering? And why the seeming triumph of evil? And this is not merely a problem for many, but rather it is the problem for many regarding belief in God. It's not merely a problem, but the problem. When you talk about why people struggle with believing in God, trusting in God, or that there is a God, it's this issue right here that they often turn to. John Stott wrote, "The fact of suffering undoubtedly constitutes the greatest challenge to the Christian faith and has been in every generation. Its distribution and degree appear to be entirely random and therefore unfair. And sensitive spirits ask if it can possibly be reconciled with God's justice and love." This is the question of humanity. It's not just something that is relevant to our day, to our culture, to our time. When you look throughout the history of the church, this is a question that has always been wrestled with. Why evil? Why suffering? How do we reconcile the existence of evil and suffering with God's justice and love, is what Stott puts forth. And many believe that it can't be reconciled. The problem of evil and suffering has been referred to as the rock of atheism. The rock of atheism. It is the foundation of atheism, that there is no God, no belief in God. We oftentimes think of atheism being built on scientific evidence or scientific theories, evolution, Big Bang, things along those lines. But at its core, atheism isn't built upon that, but rather on the issue of evil. It's built upon the obvious admission that the existence of evil and suffering is present in this world. That's what atheists stand upon. Randy Alcorn, in his book, If God is Good, writes, "You will not get far in a conversation with someone who rejects the Christian faith before the problem of evil is raised, pulled out like the ultimate trump card. It's supposed to silence believers and prove that the all-good and all-powerful God of the Bible doesn't exist." Have you ever heard someone make that argument? I can't believe that there's a God when there's hospitals filled with children suffering from cancers. I can't believe there's a God when a massive wave would wash ashore and wipe out 400,000 people in a moment. Where's God when a tornado levels an Oklahoma town? Where's God? There's evil, there's suffering. And you think there's a God? So what do we say to those who doubt or deny the existence of God based upon the evil and suffering we experience in this world? How do we respond? How do we give an answer of the hope that lies within us that, yes, we believe there is a God, and yes, we believe that He is good, and yes, we believe that He is loving, in spite of the reality of knowing that there is evil and there is suffering in this life? How do we answer that? Well, that's what we're going to think about tonight. And I want us to start by understanding the argument. We need to understand the argument that is made by those who see evil and suffering as reason to doubt and to deny the existence of God. We need to understand what it is that they're putting forth. They see evil and suffering as a means, a reason, a legitimate reason to doubt or to deny the existence of God. So here's how their argument goes. You've got it there in your notes on the front side of that page. First, they put forth the premise that a perfectly powerful, think omnipotent, all-powerful, a perfectly powerful being can prevent any evil. A perfectly powerful being can prevent any evil. We could say it this way: God, who is omnipotent, can prevent any evil. All right, that's the first premise of their argument. Secondly, they would add that a perfectly good being will prevent evil as far as he can. So an all-powerful God can prevent any evil, and a perfectly good being, a good God, will prevent evil as far as he can. And that brings us to the third premise of the argument. God is perfectly powerful and good, right? So a perfectly powerful being can prevent evil. A perfectly good being will prevent evil as far as he can. And so it reasons then, number 4, if a perfectly powerful and good God exists, there will be no evil. All right, do you see the argument that they're making here? A powerful God and a good God, there will then be no evil. But then we come to number 5. There is evil in this world. And then the conclusion, the deduction from this is, therefore, an all good and all powerful God does not exist. And underneath that, just a couple of subpoints. It may be that he is all powerful, but he isn't good enough to intervene and prevent evil. Or he doesn't care enough. Or he is not loving enough. He may have the ability, he just doesn't have the concern. Or he may be good, he may have the concern, but yet he lacks the power to intervene and prevent evil. As such, we ultimately wind up at the same place. There is no God, especially the God of the Bible. So this is the argument for those who would see the problem of evil as a reason to doubt or deny the existence of God. If God is all powerful, if God is all good and all loving, then there should be no evil, but there is. Therefore, the deduction is that an all good, all powerful God does not exist. C.S. Lewis in his work, The Problem of Pain, and C.S. Lewis was an atheist before his conversion, and this was one of the main reasons, according to Lewis, why he was the problem of evil. He would later reflect on it, and this is what he would write. His summary of this argument: if God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy, therefore God lacks either goodness or power or both. That's kind of a paragraph summary of the argument that's laid out before you in those 6 propositions. So that's the argument. If he's an all-powerful God and an all-good God, there should be no evil. There is, therefore, an all-powerful, all-good God does not exist. Now, when we look at it, at first glance, that might seem like a plausible argument. Seems to be logically crafted, constructed, seems to flow upon the progression of logic. However, we need to consider carefully the premises and propositions of the argument. The atheists and deists take the premises given in Numbers 1 through 5 to be valid. What they would say is what is presented to you in Numbers 1 through 5, that this is truth, this is valid. And it leads to the conclusion stated in number 6 that God doesn't exist. However, if one of those premises given in the argument doesn't prove true, then the argument itself isn't valid. It's built upon untrue premises, unsound logic. And so we need to look carefully at the argument that's before us. And when we do, what we discover is some things are true. Some things are true. Namely, Numbers 1, 3, and 5. Those 3 premises do hold true. As Bible-believing Christians, we can affirm Numbers 1, 3, and 5. Number 1, it upholds that God is all-powerful and that he can prevent any evil from happening. The Bible teaches us that absolutely clearly, with great clarity. Genesis 18:14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? No. Jeremiah uses that same language. Jeremiah 32, verses 26 and 27. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too hard for me? No. The Lord is all-powerful. He is omnipotent. And he can work all things according to the counsel of his will. Ephesians 1, verse 11. So God has all power, and God can use that power to prevent evil from happening. So number 1 is true. It's a valid statement. We would also agree that number 3 is a true statement, that God is perfectly powerful and always good. God is perfectly powerful and always good. Of course, number 1 makes the argument that he is perfectly powerful. 3 puts forth that he is perfectly powerful and good. And of course, the Bible teaches that. He's good. Exodus 34, verse 6, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness. That's how the Lord is described. He abounds in goodness. 1 Chronicles 16:34. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. Psalm 25, verse 8. Good and upright is the Lord. Psalm 34, verse 8. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Psalm 119, verse 68. You are good, listen, and you do good. You are good and you do good, the psalmist declared. And then Jesus affirms the goodness of God as well during his earthly ministry. Mark chapter 10, as he encounters the rich young ruler, as he approaches him and refers to him as good master, you remember the response that Jesus gave? Why do you call me good? There is no one good but one. That is God. So in the argument, we would uphold, number 1, that God is absolutely omnipotent, and number 3, that he is absolutely perfectly good. And we would also affirm number 5. We would certainly, by our observation and experience in this life, affirm that number 5 is true as well, that evil and suffering exist. There is evil in this world. So, in the argument, we would say 1, 3, and 5 all hold true. There's truth found. And I think we always need to be mindful of this, that that's always one of the enemy's tactics. He works in truth, but he sprinkles in error. It's like rat poisoning. Rat poisoning is 95% cornmeal and 5% arsenic. It's not the 95% that'll kill you. It's the 5%. Well, it's the same in this argument. There's some truth that is there. There's some cornmeal mixed in here. But there's some error that we need to notice as well. There's a serious flaw in the argument that's before us. And it's found in premise number 2. Premise number 2. Where the argument states that a perfectly good being will prevent evil as far as he can. A perfectly good being will prevent evil as far as he can. Now, if that premise is false, it will then in turn lead to both 4 and 6 being unfounded as well. 1, 3, and 5 we would say are absolutely true. But if 2 is a false premise, then the outcome of those propositions will be rendered untrue because it's built on unsound logic in its totality. So 4, a perfectly powerful and good God exists, there will be no evil, doesn't necessarily render itself to be true. And then of course 6, therefore an all good and all powerful God doesn't exist. So it seems that the argument hangs upon this second premise. So what's the issue with it? What's the issue with number 2? Well, this proposition that a good God will prevent evil is only true if God has no good reason for allowing evil. Let me say that again. This premise is only true if God has no good reason for allowing evil. A perfectly good being will prevent evil as far as he can. But that's only true if there's not a greater good to be served by that evil taking place. If, in the plans and purposes of God, there's a good reason to allow evil and suffering, then he would not want to prevent it in any and every circumstance. All right? That's the fallacy of that second argument, that second premise. Let me see if I can give us an illustration to hopefully capture what I'm getting at here. The fallacy of that second premise is debunked in the very way that we operate as parents. As parents, we exercise powers that our children don't, and we possess an unending and an enduring desire for their good. However, we also recognize there are occasions in the lives of our children when there may be a good reason for them to experience pain and suffering, right? There may be a good reason for them to experience pain and suffering. Perhaps it's a surgery that they need. And we know that the surgery will be difficult. The recovery will be hard. They'll experience pain, but we know there's a greater good to come out of that experience. It's the same thing when we apply discipline to the lives of our children. We teach little Johnny to not run in the parking lot because we recognize that the discipline that he experiences, the pain, the discomfort, the suffering that Johnny has to endure leads to a better good of him not being run over by a car in the street. What we understand is that parents are still good while also allowing and administering pain and suffering in the lives of their children at the same time. And sometimes it's moral and sometimes it's natural, right? Sometimes we let them go across the monkey bars when they're young, knowing that they're not going to make it, that they're going to take a fall and tumble in the dirt. But you know what? Sometimes you just got to be tough in life. Get up, dust off, and keep going again. Experience the natural evil of falling off the monkey bars in life. Sometimes it's moral evil, right? Sometimes, especially as they get older, we know that they're going to make a decision. They're making a determination. We know that it's unwise. We know where it's going to lead them. We know where it's going to take them. But we know if they go through that experience, that coming out on the other side, there will be a greater good that will result from it. They experience that moral evil from a flawed decision or flawed action that they undertook. And as parents, we allow that to happen because we know there's something on the other end that's coming. This is what's known as the greater good theodicy. The word theodicy is composed of two Greek words, the word for God, theos, and dikaios for just, and it simply speaks of the justice of God. And in a theodicy, we're arguing for the justice of God as a result of the greater good that comes about through the pain and suffering and evil that he would allow to take place in this world. Simply because there is evil and suffering in this world doesn't mean there is no God or that God isn't good or all-powerful. That's a faulty premise. Simply because there is evil and suffering in this world doesn't mean that there is no God or that God isn't good or all-powerful. Now, some might object to that and might argue that God could not possibly have a good reason for allowing evil. What possible reason could God have for allowing evil? Well, here's the question that I would ask, and we'll talk about this at some point in our study of apologetics. The burden of proof doesn't always lie upon us. They've got questions that they need to answer as well. And the question that I would ask in response to that is, well, how would you know what God's reason may or may not be? How could you prove to me what God's reason may or may not be in allowing this evil. And even though they may say that personally they don't know, nor personally could they see any reason for God to allow evil and suffering, that doesn't mean that there can't be one. Just because I don't know something personally, just because I don't understand something experientially in my own life, doesn't mean that it isn't so. Right? There's a lot about physics that I don't understand. There's a lot about physics that I do not know. But that doesn't mean that it's not the case and it's not the reality. So it is with the problem of evil and the reason that God may have in allowing it. Just because we don't know it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. In fact, God may have many reasons, but we're simply just left unaware of them. Listen to what Michael Kruger writes. He says, just because we don't know all the reasons God has for allowing evil, that doesn't mean that he does not or could not have them. And unless the skeptic can prove that God could not possibly have a good reason for allowing evil, which is impossible, then his argument falls apart. For means of greater good and through inscrutable purposes, God allows and uses evil and suffering in the world and our lives. So the greater good theodicy puts forth the justice of God in allowing evil to take place in this world, suffering to exist in this world, because he's using it to bring about a greater good. The argument of inscrutability simply says we don't know the mind of God or the ways of God. This is Isaiah 55, 3 and 4, right? His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so are his thoughts and his ways above ours. Paul would say, who has known the mind of the Lord? And who has been his counselor? And who has given him a gift that he must be repaid? How inscrutable are your ways, Paul would say in Romans chapter 11. His ways are simply beyond ours. And so when we take this into consideration and we look at the argument regarding the problem of evil as it's put before us tonight, that second premise simply does not hold. That yes, God is perfectly powerful and still perfectly good, and as such, he can allow and prevent, evil to transpire and use evil and suffering to accomplish purposes greater than we can begin to understand. And what we see is this happening in the Bible over and over and over again. I've got 3 examples there for you on your notes. Biblical examples of the greater good theodicy and inscrutability. The first one is Job. You know the story of Job. It's an entire book dealing with the problem of evil and suffering. And Job comes to the end, the last couple of chapters, where he encounters the Lord out of the whirlwind. And the Lord answers Job, and he says in chapter 40, verses 3 through 5, behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I've spoken once, and I will not answer twice, but I will proceed no further. At the end of the book, chapter 42, Job answers the Lord again, and he says, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Job comes to that conclusion as he faced almost indescribable moral and natural evil. Tornado took down the house, which all his kids were, lost all of his livestock, all of his possessions. Moral evil, Satan himself was out against him. And in the midst of all of this, at the beginning of the story of Job, we hear the words of Job. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Shall we receive good from the Lord and not evil as well? And then the Bible says, in all of these things, Job did not sin with his lips. Meaning what Job was affirming there was absolutely true. That God was using this evil to accomplish a far greater purpose, the greater good. Namely, the Lord wanted Job to see and to come to the understanding that he alone is worthy of our worship, not for what he does or for what he gives, but rather for simply who he is. The inscrutability of all that Job experienced. is that Job was left in the dark. I would remind you that Job doesn't have the first chapter. Job doesn't hear the conversation between Satan and the Lord. Job is left in the dark. His friends are left in the dark. And when God does approach Job, and he does speak to him out of the whirlwind at the end of the book, he never reveals why it is that Job suffered. Instead, Job's ignorance is simply exposed, and he then says, I'm just going to put my hand over my mouth. Job said, you know what? I thought I knew something, and I've realized I don't know nothing. So I'm just going to keep my hand over my mouth because he's God and I'm not. Greater good theodicy. God is using evil and suffering in the life of Job to bring about something far greater for him. We have the biblical example of Joseph. That's what we read tonight. Genesis 50, verse 20. In that one verse, we see these two things put forth. Yes, evil. Yes, the acts of his brothers. Yes, the acts of the caravan traders, Potiphar's wife, the cupbearer. Evil is there. Natural evil also, the severe famine that had struck the land in that day. But God meant it for good. Greater good. God was saving the world from a severe famine and persevering the lineage of the Messiah. He was keeping intact the line through which the seed that was promised in Genesis 3:15 would ultimately come through. God was persevering the plan of redemption for all mankind through what happened in Joseph's life, all of the evil included. But the inscrutability of this is that Joseph's brothers, Potiphar, Pharaoh, Jacob, none of them knew their role and their actions were playing in what God was doing. They had no clue which goods depended on which evils, and that the evils would even work toward any good at all. But that's God. That's God. Joseph said, you meant this for evil, and evil it absolutely was, but God, he said, I've got a greater good to come. And then think about Jesus. Jesus, the ultimate example. Acts 2. Verses 22 and 23, Peter is preaching there on the day of Pentecost. He stands up. Hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know, this Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Do you hear it? An evil act, a murderous act, an unjust act. But yet God allowed that evil to transpire in the life of Jesus in order to bring about the salvation and redemption of his people. Through various moral evils, Satan's promptings, Judas' betrayal, Jewish treachery, Roman injustice, the crucifixion of the Son of God, through the heinous evil of that act, God brings about the salvation that we desperately needed. God could have stopped it at any time. Remember what Jesus said? Could I not pray to my Father right now and he would send legions of angels to come, take me off of this cross at any moment? It had all been done. But he allowed the greatest evil the world has ever known to transpire. Why? To bring about a greater good. And in the midst of it all, God used various agents, human and demonic, but they had no clue. They had no idea. The Jewish leaders didn't know. Satan couldn't discern. Judas, Pilate, the soldiers, they were all ignorant of the role that they were playing in fulfilling the divinely prophesied redemptive purposes in the cross of Jesus Christ. So what do we say? Clearly, hopefully you can see tonight that the argument used in relation to the problem of evil is not a sound one. God is all powerful and God is all good, but it does not necessitate then that there will be no evil in this world. A good God can allow evil and suffering to bring about greater good in the end. So when we see that fallacy in the argument, when we understand it, we then need to be able to speak truth into it. Speak truth into the evil and suffering that we and others often face. And I want to end tonight by just giving you these few ways that we can do this. We're going to go through these kind of quick, so hold on. Number one, our response must always be, God is not evil and God never sins, but he can and does use evil to accomplish his plans. 1 John chapter 1, verse 5, in him is light and there's no darkness at all. In him is light and there's no darkness at all. Isaiah 6:8, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. James 1, verse 13, God cannot be tempted, and neither does he tempt anyone. And ultimately that brings us into Romans 8:28, because who God is, all powerful, all good, he then can take all things and work them together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purposes. God is not evil and never sins, but he can and does use evil to accomplish his plans and purposes. Number two, God may very well be restraining much of the evil and suffering we could face in the world today. Don't ever forget this. Now, the evil and the suffering that we do see, that we do know exist, it's a reality that we can't escape, and every bit of it grieves our hearts. Every case of abuse, every mistreatment of a child, it's sickening, it's gross. But it may very well be that God is restraining far more than we could ever imagine. And let the story of Job remind you of that. As the Lord is approached by Satan, Satan says, you've got this guy, but he's just this way because of all that you do for him and all that you give him. If you take it all away, he's going to curse you to your face. The Lord said, okay. He said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. The Lord said, here's the limit, and you can go no further. The Lord said, here's the line that you do not cross. And it may very well be that this day the Lord has lines in place that we are unaware of, that we may never know. Think of 9/11. A horrific tragedy that forever reshaped our country, reshaped the world. As more than 3,000 individuals went to work that day and lost their lives in those towers as they collapsed. And that's no small thing. And in no way do I want to undermine that in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But perhaps it was the mercy of God that it wasn't all 18,000 people inside those buildings that day. We may never realize how much evil God is restraining in this world. Number three, let's remember that God uses suffering to make us more Christ-like. God uses suffering to make us more Christ-like. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8, the Bible teaches us that Jesus, through his suffering, learned obedience. James teaches us in James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, that as we face various trials, all different kinds of trials, that God is working in them. The suffering and even the evil that we face, God is working in them to teach us, to grow us, to strengthen us, to build endurance in us, to make us like his Son, Jesus Christ. Number four, God uses evil and suffering to execute his judgments. Now let me be clear here. This is not the case for all evil and suffering, but for some of it for sure. Not the case for all, but for some. And I would caution us to always be careful in how we speak into the evil and suffering, because we don't have the understanding to know which is which. Right? I can't tell you because a hurricane wipes out an island that that's the judgment of God. It may be or it may not be. I don't know. His ways are not my ways. His thoughts are not my thoughts. I'll just leave that to him. But what I do know is that sometimes God uses evil and suffering to execute his judgment. We see it in Genesis. Chapter 6 through 8 with the account of the flood. That natural evil that overtook the world was an act of God's judgment against the evil that was in the heart of all mankind. Romans chapter 1, verses 24 through 32, Paul teaches us there that God gives mankind over to his sinful and evil ways as an act of judgment. God says, this is what you want, this is what I'll let you have. And it just gets progressively worse and worse and worse. It's God executing his judgment through evil and suffering. Habakkuk in the Old Testament, that prophet, he struggled with this. And his struggle came because he saw and knew that God was going to use the enemy of his people, the Chaldeans, to come down and execute judgment on them, to take them away. And he struggled with this. God, how are you going to use this evil people in this fashion? And the answer that Habakkuk got was, I'm using this to execute the judgment against my people because of their sin against me, their idolatry, their unfaithfulness to the covenants. So God uses evil and suffering in some occasions to execute his judgments. Number 5, God delays justice not to make our lives miserable, but to make them possible. Now, here's what I mean by that. Because a lot of times when we look at evil and suffering in this world, especially gratuitous evil, pointless evil, evil that simply makes absolutely no sense, we want to know, man, where's the justice for that? Right? Where's the justice? Why is that evil person still breathing? Why are they above the ground? Why don't they get another day? And as that goes on, we just feel anger, frustration, aggravation, irritation, miserable. Why don't they get what they deserve? And I understand that. But I would remind us all that if we all got what we all deserve, none of us would be here tonight. For the wages of sin is death. I don't know if you remember Ecclesiastes, but the preacher in Ecclesiastes had a section about that. And that's when I shared my desire for justice for shopping carts with you, buggies, right? You want to get my ire, leave a buggy in the parking lot. Leave a buggy in the parking lot. That'll light my fire in a heartbeat. Put the buggy in the buggy corral. Put it up. Put it up. Well, my issue may not be putting shopping carts up, but I promise you I've got some other issues. And it's amazing how quick I want justice for those things, but not justice for my own sins. So don't mistake God's delay in justice as something to make your life miserable, but rather that it makes your life possible. Number 6, always be encouraged to remember that God has entered our world of evil and suffering. Christ came, and he dwelt among us in this world. He faced the grief, the sorrow, the evil. He was accustomed to that. He's not unfamiliar with that. What an encouraging thought to know that he understands all that we are facing. Number 7, God has an eternal solution to evil and suffering. Here it is, heaven and hell. God's going to wrap this thing up one day, and in the end, it'll all be settled. All accounts will be dealt with. And ultimately, as Randy Alcorn says, God has an eternal 2-part solution to the problem of the righteous presently suffering and the wicked presently prospering, heaven and hell. Heaven and hell. Do you remember in Matthew 25, Jesus gives us the parable of the talents? Those stewards were given those talents when their master went away, and he comes back, and one of them had multiplied it 2 times over. The other one, he got a little bit of return, and then you had the one who buried it in the dirt. Master comes back and says, hey, I'm going to give this to you because I knew you were this man. You were a hard man. You were a just man. I didn't want to do anything with this, what you gave. So here it is. And you remember what Jesus says, that parable? It's the parable of the kingdom. He says those first 2, enter into the joys of your master. But that last one, Jesus, this is how Jesus refers to him in the story that Jesus is weaving together. He calls him a wicked servant. You wicked servant. And at the end, Jesus says, you take this wicked servant, this evil servant, and you cast them into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Understand this, it'll all be dealt with when Jesus comes again. Nothing will be left undone. He has an eternal solution. And then finally, number 8, God uses evil and suffering as a backdrop to display the fullness of his glory. God uses evil and suffering as a backdrop to display the fullness of his glory. In John 9, we have the story of the man born blind. Remember that? Disciples see him, Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus said, you knuckleheads. None of them. He said, this man was born blind so that you may see the glory of God. This man entered into life with a natural evil, natural suffering, so that the glory of God may put on display for him and for all of you to see. And Jesus healed the man born blind. Remember, he went before the council and he said, I don't know what to tell you. I once was blind, but now I see. You decide who he is. It was in the backdrop of his suffering that God said, get a glimpse of this glory. And it's on the backdrop of the blackness of evil and suffering that we face in this life, that is a reality in this world, that we can get the fullness of the glory of God in the gospel of his Son, Jesus Christ. It's that oft-used illustration, but I'll close with it tonight. And I mean, it's true. It happens. I remember it happening when I went and got Kathy's engagement ring. You go to the jeweler, you pick out that diamond, they pull it out of the case and they put it up there on the countertop, and they pull out that black piece of felt. And they take that diamond and they put it right there in the center of it. And they turn it with them little tweezers and they put on the little white glove and they go over the 4 C's, the diamonds. And it's on that black backdrop. And they've got it there because they know and they understand that that diamond is going to sparkle and shine a whole lot more against that black background than in anything else. The glory of God shines bright, shines bold, and shines forth on the backdrop of the evil and suffering that we face in this world. There is no problem of evil that God will not deal with, because he's good and he's powerful. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word tonight. God, we pray that, Lord, it would help strengthen our faith. God, we thank you that you're a God who is good and loving, and you're a God who is powerful, and God, that your ways are above ours and beyond ours, and God, we're finite and fallen creatures, and God, forgive us for ever speaking against you. Help us to learn to keep our hands over our mouths. And God, tonight may we trust that your ways are always good, and help us to see your glory shining even in the dark seasons of our life. Father, be with us as we go tonight. God, if it's your will that we should gather this next Lord's Day, let us come eager and longing to gaze upon your glory. For we